Hey guys, welcome back. So I don't know if you guys noticed or not, but we actually hit 30,000 subs on this channel not too long ago, which is just still really crazy to me. Mainly because I just refuse to believe that anyone actually likes watching these videos. I literally started doing them because I just wanted to make reviews that I enjoyed watching. But apparently there's a good chunk of you out there that actually likes watching them too. And if you do, well, here's a whole mess of them in one collection for you to watch. And this is also a good chance for all the newbies to the channel to kind of catch up a little bit. Also, I kind of had to take it a little bit easy this week since channel artist Amanda Wood fell off a ladder and actually hurt her hand. So she's healing up until next week. But enough of the blabbering. I just wanted to thank all of you guys for watching these videos and helping the channel grow. It really does mean a ton to me. And I'm sure it'll mean a lot to Amanda too after they break her out of her full body cast. In the meantime though, let's just get this collection of reviews going. Now, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Shaq Fu for the Super Nintendo probably ruined quite a few kids' weekends back when it came out in 1994. And unless this is your first week on the internet, then I don't think I need to explain to you why Shaq Fu has become such a meme legend in the video game community years after the fact. I mean, it's Shaq in a fighting game, and that alone is enough to cement this game's legacy. But even back when this game came out, most of us kids were just kind of scratching our heads as to why this even existed.
Sega Genesis and Super NES.
Yes, Shaq was popular, but I never put him in the same league of mainstream popularity as someone like Michael Jordan.
Ready?
I could understand that dude getting Saturday morning cartoons and weird video game spin-offs that almost had nothing to do with basketball. But Shaq? I mean, the only thing that I ever remember him doing besides playing basketball was completely ruining what should have been a totally fun comic book movie with Steel.
It's hammer time.
And then going on to slum it up for kids in Kazam. I mean, you guys remember Kazam, right? Where Shaq played a genie who gave some annoying kid 3 wishes? Who wanted that movie?
A genie.
But the crazy thing is that those movies came out years after Shaq Fu came out.
What a magnetic personality.
So when Shaq Fu was released to just about every single system known to man at the time, kids were just kind of like, what is this? And as soon as you look at the back of the box, we got even more confused when it wasn't a basketball game. Instead, of course, this is a fighting game.
Which was the style at the time.
And even crazier, it actually looks pretty good from some of these screenshots. But as we all know, things would quickly go off the rails as soon as kids started playing this thing. Get into the game and it's about as dumb as you expect it to be. Shaq is in town for a charity basketball game and of course stumbles into an old mysterious shop where the owner starts calling him the Chosen One and tells him that he needs to go into another dimension to save some kid. Of course, Shaq being Shaq agrees to do this and finds himself on a map screen where you can then wander Tiny Shaq around to find your next fight to progress the game. But first off, before we get into the gameplay, I just want to mention the one thing that I think this game really deserves some praise for, and that's just the animation. Every character movement in this game is animated extremely well, and I'm not talking just like good, I'm talking like really good. And this was years before Capcom would even attempt this style of animation in Street Fighter 3. Of course, they did it a lot better there, but I mean, this is still really great. And it didn't hurt that the developer, Delphine Software, was already known for incredible rotoscoped animation with their work on Flashback. And they definitely carried over that expertise to Shaq Fu with some ridiculously good animations. Like I said, I mean, this is still genuinely impressive for how fluid this game is. Even Tiny Shaq on the map screen is animated really well. But the problem is that Delphine Software wasn't really known for making fighting games, like at all. Sure, Flashback was amazing, but that wasn't exactly the most precise game ever with its delayed inputs requiring you to do stuff well before the action actually happens. And I don't think I need to tell you that that style of gameplay does not translate well to a fighting game where you need super precise timing and movement to just get the basics right, let alone make it fun. Your character feels extremely sluggish as you have to wait patiently for just about everything to play out before you can get another input in, making every fight feel like it's playing out in slow motion most of the time, even though it's not. It's just that delayed with everything that you do. It looks good, but there's no immediate reactions to anything. You literally have to play it like flashback and just start planning your moves way out in advance. You can sort of get used to it, but even then, this is still just a really bad fighting game. It essentially just boils down to you hoping that you can get a punch or a kick in when you can, and just hope that you can cheese the AI enough to win a couple of rounds. You do get special attacks, but thanks to the instructions not telling you how to do any of them, you just kind of have to figure out how to do them on your own. And even after you do, getting these moves to work is just an absolute chore thanks to those delayed inputs. At least with kicks and punches, you can kinda make it work, but the instant you have to start doing multi-input combinations, then good luck. And even when you do manage to pull one off, their animation is so slow that you'll probably get hit before they even happen. It also doesn't help that every single time you pull off one of these, it sounds like someone's screaming in pain, which I guess at least mirrors how the person trying to play it feels. The game does at least throw in a few things to kind of try to make it seem like it has some depth, like a force field that you can activate while ducking, and a dash button that makes moving around even more unwieldy. There's also a fury bar that makes your character stronger when it's full, but the game plays so poorly that none of this really gets much use. Even if you try to play this thing like a real fighting game, which trust me, I tried, it always just evolves into a button-mashing mess. Just about every match that I played ended with the time running out because neither of us could hit each other enough because we were just flailing at each other and hoping that something would connect. It's just not a good fighting game. But is it the worst fighting game ever? Well, I don't think so. There's still a lot of bad fighting games out there that are far worse than old Shaq Fu here. But I think this game's legendary bad status comes from it simply ruining a lot of kids' weekends when they brought this thing home from the video store. And it's good enough looking to make you want to try to get further in it, but the gameplay's just so bad that it makes it impossible to get very good at the game at all. So every time you do play it, it just ends up being frustrating. Frustrating because it's obviously a bad fighting game with Shaq in it for whatever damn reason, and even more frustrating that you just wasted $5 on it. So if you rented this one back in the day, you have my condolences. Thank goodness Shaq stuck with ruining movies instead of video games after this mess of a fighting game came out.
It's Wayne's World, party time, excellent!
Of course, we can't talk about horrible decisions at the video store without Wayne's World for the Super Nintendo. And I'm pretty sure you all know how this is gonna end, but let's talk about it anyway because I'm pretty positive that a lot of you rented this one back in the day and instantly regretted it. But the game did come from probably one of the best movies that's ever come out of Saturday Night Live, except for Stuart Saves His Family, which is a really good movie and I will hear nothing to the contrary. But unlike Stuart Smalley, Wayne's World became a cultural phenomenon back when it came out. It was the perfect counterculture movie for the time, effortlessly turning the emerging underground rock scene of the early 90s into a full-blown pop culture event. And it didn't hurt that it was hilarious. It single-handedly brought Queen back thanks to one damn scene in the whole movie. Of course, I was a big fan of it as a kid, but I think maybe I was just a little bit too young for a lot of the more adult humor to land, because, well, it was aimed more at adults.
Wayne's World.
And that seemed to be the problem that the developers had making this game as well. Like, how do you make a Wayne's World game for dumb kids on the Super Nintendo? Well, I don't think they ever figured it out, because what we ended up with is the exact opposite of what made the movie so much fun. And if you're wondering on what they settled on as the main premise for a Wayne's World game, well, the manual's here to make things even more confusing. And we're gonna get more into this manual here in a minute, but as far as the setup goes, well, it's Garth has been kidnapped and sucked into a video game by a purple gelatinous cube named Xantar. Not the evil corporate Noah's Arcade guy from the movie, not Rob Lowe, but Xantar, a pixelated purple putridosity of the first degree, which is how the manual describes it. And already you can tell that the writers were just grabbing at straws here. You of course play as Wayne as you make your way through a bunch of levels in your attempt to find and free Garth. And to the game's credit, Wayne controls about as well as you'd expect from a guy who spends most of his life sitting on a couch in his basement. So, I mean, honestly, about as well as I'd control in a video game, which is not very well. The B button makes you jump, the Y button fires your guitar like some sort of sonic weapon, and the A button unleashes a swing attack. And I know you're expecting me to make fun of that, but you're not getting any complaints from me because I genuinely think that's probably the funniest thing in this whole damn game. Besides your swing attack that blows up all the enemies on the screen, you do get a few different power-ups to give Wayne different chords, like faster shots, spread shots, or just a really big shot. I mean, it's nice that they're here, but none of them really change how bad it feels to actually shoot anything with them, but more on that here in a second. And really, I do think the game gives you enough stuff to play around with for what should be a fun action platformer, but the big problem is that none of it's really any fun. Wayne honestly doesn't feel too bad in the grand scheme of things, and his guitar attacks do get the job done for the most part, but the levels in this game are just pure garbage. They're these giant mazes that just do not seem to end, with the same repeating graphics and obstacles every few seconds, making it almost impossible to figure out where you've been or where you need to go. You'll end up circling back over and over to the same spots, just trying to figure out which random platform's gonna take you to the next section. Now I know I harp on these types of levels every once in a while in these games, but Wayne's World may just be the worst example of this kind of stage design I've ever seen. There's just no rhyme or reason to any of this. It's just a bunch of platforms tossed in randomly. And the enemies in the level just kind of make it all worse, since they're all just waiting far enough off the screen to hit you with a cheap shot every single time, just making you constantly jam on the attack button so that you hit him before you even see him. And if anything's coming at you in the air, then you just better run, because Wayne does this wind-up animation whenever you want to jump and attack something, making it so horribly delayed that it's just almost completely useless to even use. Also, just look at these embarrassing excuses for enemies. It all just kind of looks like generic cartoon stuff with almost nothing to do with Wayne's World besides some of them being instruments. I know that the game is supposed to be about these random things being from a video game dimension, but I mean, come on. They all look like they were just copy and pasted from early 90s clip art software. So with all that being said, you kind of just end up with this hodgepodge of a bad game. What you kind of end up doing in Wayne's World is just trying to find your way through these awful mazes, dodging constant cheap hits from these stupid enemies and obstacles, and just hoping that you're going the right way. The jumping feels bad, the action's almost non-existent, and the only stuff that actually feels like it's from Wayne's World is in the manual for the game. And that's maybe the saddest part of the whole thing, because the manual's actually pretty hysterical. It's full of dumb jokes, warnings, and all this meta commentary that honestly captures the Wayne's World vibe more than the actual game does. But when you play it, it's just another crappy platformer where you fight cartoon trombones. Wait, I take that back. That's not actually the saddest part of the whole game. The real worst part of the game is you don't even get a good rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody here. You just get this. Wayne's World for the Super Nintendo is one of those games that really doesn't seem like it would work no matter what you did with it. The movie has almost nothing that you could really make a video game about unless it was like an adventure game or something. And while what they did here was at least an effort, it's a hell of a reach to say any of this is about Wayne's World. It feels like they were just desperately trying to shove a game into something that didn't need a game. And when the manual is the best thing about the whole thing, you know you done goofed. So if you're a hardcore collector, then yeah, sure, throw this on your shelf next to other weirdos like Home Improvement and Cool World. But if you're looking for a game that's actually worth playing, this one isn't worthy. Just go watch the movie instead. Hey, check it out. We've actually got two fighting games in the same video. That's actually pretty rare. But maybe calling Ballz a fighting game is a bit generous. Yes, at its core, it's trying desperately to be a fighting game, but it's a weird 3D gimmick, awful characters, and humor tailor-made for a 5-year-old makes it feel more like someone's experimental side project more than a game you'd want to play with someone else. And when you start a game off with music like this, then you know you're in for something special. Ballz rolled its way onto your Super Nintendo back in 1994, promising 3D fighting at its ballsiest. And if you think that this is the last reference to male reproductive organs, then you've obviously never played Ballz, because that's literally all this game ever wants to talk about. But I think that the game knew that it needed something to sell to kids, because looking at the back of the box and well, it looks awful. All the characters are just made up of circles and they don't look appealing at all. But the back of the box is desperately pleading its case with a full 3D fighting game, apparently, 3 times the special moves of other games, along with weird sound effects and a wisecracking scoreboard. Whatever that means. But to its credit, it got my attention at least, because I actually rented this damn thing out of sheer curiosity and the promise of a 3D fighting game. But what I got instead was, well, you'll see. Jump into the game and you're met with Ballz' eclectic selection of characters. You get stuff like clowns, dinosaurs, cavemen, and even a flamingo. And I can kind of see why the characters look like they came from a first grader's coloring book, since all these characters had to sort of stand out with unique designs due to them all being made up of shaded spheres. You need to be able to tell what they are based on basic shapes. Almost like how whenever you sketch a human or an animal, you usually start building it out with different sizes of circles and other shapes. But in Ballz, that's all you get. And that actually leads into this game's big 3D gimmick and why they went this route. The developers were able to create this sort of 3D effect using these spheres to make up their characters, along with a rotating playing field. And it does actually play in 3 dimensions, since pressing up or down will actually cause your character to walk into and out of the background. Something that was actually almost unheard of back then, especially on home console. But just because a proof of concept works doesn't exactly make it a fun game. And that's where Ballz literally falls apart. Because I guarantee you that the first time that you play a round of this game, you'll probably be completely confused as to what's even happening. Characters stretch and deform their balls in ways that's supposed to represent kicks, punches, and throws. But it's genuinely hard to tell what's even happening half the time, let alone trying to land those attacks. It's also super sluggish, both in gameplay and its animation. And just like in Shaq, these characters are actually animated really well for what it's worth. It's just hard to try and figure out what they're even supposed to be doing, thanks to everything looking like an unfinished sketch. But again, just like Shaq, you can eventually kinda get used to it, but at that point you've got to actually learn how to play it effectively, which is an even bigger challenge. Each character gets a punch and a kick button, and depending on which direction you're pressing, you may or may not get something different. You also get a throw that your character may or may not do if you get close, along with a grapple that your character may or may not do, where you have to jam on the punch button to overpower your opponent. And if you're seeing a pattern here, well, you're very observant, because everything about this game is just very hit or miss as to if what you're trying to do even happens. Sometimes it works and other times it doesn't. And that probably has a lot to do with the game constantly rotating around these characters, but you just can't really tell if you're in position or not due to all these balls just being jumbled together. All of the characters do at least get an assortment of special moves, but just like everything else, it's kind of impossible to be consistent with any of it. So Ballz just pretty much completely fails at being a playable fighting game. But what about the overall experience of it? And to be fair, the game itself seems to be more in love with its ability to say balls over and over than it does having decent gameplay. And in that respect, I guess Ballz is at least memorable. That much-touted scoreboard is constantly in the background of every stage, giving out random blurbs that I guess are trying to be humorous smack talk. But the first time it told me to open wide for Chunky, I was more confused than anything else. Ballz honestly feels more like a tech demo than anything else. It's a neat idea for the time, but it just doesn't come together as anything that's more fun than a few minutes of button mashing with a friend. And I guess maybe if you got some enjoyment out of its super simple gameplay based around a 3D gimmick, and maybe chuckled a few times at the game's bizarre humor, then you might have considered this a solid rental. I, on the other hand, absolutely hated this game. I was pulled in with those fancy-looking 3D-ish graphics and was instantly disappointed with how slow and sluggish the whole thing felt. Plus, I think Clay Fighter had already cornered the market on gimmicky fighting games with questionable humor a year earlier. And I really don't think I was alone in thinking that, since Ballz pretty much just faded into obscurity shortly after. When you tell me that the high point of your game franchise was a version of it for the 3DO, then I think we can safely assume that we've all heard the last of Ballz as a fighting game. But amazingly enough, that wasn't actually the end of the technology that powered Ballz, since the developer PF Magic would go on to use it to create a little line of computer virtual pet software called Pets. And I'm pretty sure if you had a computer in the late 90s and early 2000s, then you've probably seen them. Cats, dogs, hamsters, and just about every other damn animal they could shove into this thing littered Walmart PC software shelves for over a decade. And they were no joke either, because they sold over 20 million copies of these things. It's kind of crazy to think that Ballz, of all things, had to fail for Pets to succeed in ways that the developer probably never dreamed of. But for those of us that wasted a few bucks renting this weird attempt of a fighting game back in the day, I think we would have all probably just rather had a refund. And first up, let's take a look at Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Super Nintendo. And while I've never played this one myself, I've never really heard much anything positive about it. But before we deal with that game, let's take a second to talk about the movie, because honestly, that's probably going to be the most interesting thing about this whole game.
Dracula.
This is another movie that I actually got to see with my mom and dad back when it came out, and I remember this movie getting pushed as a pretty big deal, which was kinda unusual for a big R-rated horror movie. I'm guessing due to it being directed by Coppola and having an absolutely all-star cast. And from what I remember, it was definitely different. I really like the sets and the visual effects of the movie, but besides Gary Oldman's now iconic look and take on Dracula, the rest of the movie was it was okay. And any scene that Keanu was in was just torturous to sit through, even back then as a kid.
I know where the bastard sleeps.
I know a lot of people these days talk about the wooden acting in the Star Wars prequels, but man, in my opinion, Keanu in Dracula is just as meme-worthy for how bad he is.
I've seen many strange things already.
But since this was a big movie release from Columbia Pictures, you better believe that Sony ImageSoft was here to belch it out onto every single system they could get it onto. Now, the Sega CD version of the game is probably the most well-known, since they made that one using state-of-the-art stuff at the time. But that's not what we've got here on the lowly Super Nintendo, because what we ended up with here is more like a low-rent Castlevania. And that's exactly the impression that you get as soon as you see this box. And while it's nothing too special, I gotta say that I always did love the look of this title. That's just classic horror to me. But the back of the box is mostly just bland. The screenshots are at least here, but they don't really look that great. And the text over here is trying its hardest to make you think that this game is just as big of a deal as the movie. It even goes so far to say that this has incredible 3D graphics. And I'm gonna tell you right now, there ain't a damn thing in this game that comes close to 3D. Half the time it can barely be bothered to do 2D. But just for the time being, let's put all that to the side and see if this game itself is less of a car wreck than it's been made out to be. Get into the game and I hate this already. You take control of Jonathan Harker, who doesn't control too bad at first, but you'll quickly realize that he's apparently cursed to constantly walk on ice as he slides forwards and backwards with even the slightest movement. And normally this wouldn't be too awful, but just about every enemy in this game is making a beeline straight for Harker, and your only way of attacking them is with this tiny dagger that has almost zero range, and depending on the enemy, even less range than it seems, since your dagger doesn't always connect even when you're stabbing right through them. This means that you're just constantly taking damage because everything's hitting you before you can even get close enough to hit them. And even then, you're usually getting hit while you're hitting them. You can at least find a sword in the first level that's a decent upgrade, but even just doing that it's super weird. In fact, let's just get into that because I don't know where else to go with this. So you wander around the first stage a bit and you'll eventually find Van Helsing standing around. Walk up to him and he'll think about a weapon. Okay, sure. He doesn't give it to you or anything like that. He just apparently likes the idea of this sword. But what that means is that you can now find the weapon somewhere in the stage. That has to be the most convoluted way of getting a weapon upgrade I've ever seen in a game. And it's not even consistent because sometimes you'll just find weapons out in the open without finding Van Helsing. It's just a super strange way of doing things. I'm not sure why they made it like this. But that's not the only reason you need to find Van Helsing, because if you don't, then you won't be able to exit the stage. Sure, you can find the end of the level, but nothing's gonna happen. But if you wander up to Van Helsing, then the exit will appear somewhere. And you know how you actually exit the stage? Not by walking to it or jumping into the giant text that says exit. No, what you actually have to do is walk up to it and then duck in the vicinity of the exit sign. And then just everything explodes for some reason. Why? But that's the basics of how you play this thing. You wander around these pretty bad levels, swing at enemies that are either already up your ass or on their way in because of the constant respawning, and just hope that you can survive until you either find Van Helsing or a boss shows up. And special mention also goes to these completely bullshit stage traps too. Look at this. Look how accurate you have to be with this dude to just make it through these things. And if you get hit, all of your health is gone in a second because there's no invincibility state of when you get hit. It's like everything in this game was designed to maximize the amount of annoyance that you have with it. And the bosses that I mentioned are just as bad, but at least they break up the awful action with their own awful issues. None of them have no more than 2 attacks, and that's being generous, all of which they just repeat over and over regardless of where you are or what you're doing. It's the kind of boss battles where you'll end up hurting yourself out of sheer tedium more than any challenge that they pose. I mean, I guess the game does have a decent look to it, and it does have some nice enemy variety, even if that variety consists of things that you'd never be fighting in a Dracula game, like scorpions and drunk guys throwing bottles at you. The colors the game uses are mostly subdued, which I guess works for the game, but nothing stands out at all. There's no big set pieces or anything like that, which sucks because that was the one thing from the movie that I really liked. The castle levels could look like something out of Castlevania if you just squint hard enough though, but at that point, you may as well just go play Castlevania. Any of them are better than this. Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Super Nintendo is the quintessential Sony ImageSoft published game. It looks okay, but plays like they gave the developer a shoestring budget and 4 weeks to finish it. And that really sucks because this one was actually developed by Psygnosis, and those dudes have made legendary games before and after this. I guess it's good to know that they'd at least still have a lot of success after this, but man, Dracula has to be a dark stain on what's an otherwise amazing resume. So as always, thanks Sony ImageSoft, you always bring out the best in your developers. Anyway, I think it goes without saying that even if you're a fan of the movie, just stay away from the Super Nintendo version. Maybe try out that Sega CD game though if you're curious, because that one's at least kinda neat to look at, even if it is nearly unplayable. But as for this one, I don't think even Dracula would want to suck on this sucky 16-bit horror show. Next up, we've got Warlock for the Super Nintendo, and this is actually maybe one of the more confusing releases that I've seen on the system. It's definitely one of those games that kind of makes you do a double take after learning that it even exists. Now, I've only ever seen bits and pieces of the Warlock movie over the years, but even with barely knowing anything about the movie, I don't think the game has much to do with it. Even though this game is apparently based off the first film, according to what I could find online, the story and what you're actually doing in the game more closely follows Warlock Armageddon, which is the 1993 sequel. And even though the original Warlock movie was barely successful and had absolutely zero sway with kids at the playground, that still didn't stop the madmen at LJN and Real-Time Associates from blessing us with a Super Nintendo game. Like I've said before, you could get any game made back then. But let's just say you were some sort of Warlock super fan back then, and you were just hankering for a video game based on your favorite movie. Well, would this box get your attention? I mean, it is the poster from the movie, but as the front of the Super Nintendo box, it's not really doing much for me, even if you do have a cool title. But hold on, because holy crap, just look at the back of this box. I don't even care what the front of the box is, because this right here, this would have instantly sold me on playing this game. Fire-breathing dragons, undead skeleton warriors, whatever the hell this thing is over here in the dungeon's bowels. I mean, sweet Christ, man, sign me up. And if the game is even half as good as these screenshots, then this is like the best game that's ever been made. But something tells me that we may end up having this game drop out of our bowels before we have any fun with it. As mentioned, the actual story to the game is more in line with Warlock 2, just switched up a little bit. This one has you playing as a young druid on your quest to find the 6 runestones to stop that pesky Warlock that's recently shown back up. You do at least get a nice little cinematic where your Warlock is resurrected like a ghost from Ghostbusters, and then has your character wandering up to your druid friends and being like, hey, you guys know that Warlock? He just got resurrected over there. And they're like, yeah, sure, you just go over there, buddy. And thus starts your quest to save the world from the Warlock in this very cozy looking village. And the first thing you'll notice is that this is yet another one of those games that's decided to have a ton of character animation over having responsive controls. And it's not even like Flashback or Out of This World where everything is following the same timing as your character, because everything in Warlock reacts like you're playing super ghouls and ghosts while your character just takes ages to turn around. And you have to be able to react, because this is essentially an action game whenever you strip all that Warlocky stuff away, and not a very good one. Once you do get your bearings with the controls finally, you're gonna need to learn how to play this bad boy, and thankfully it's actually got some neat tricks up its cloak. Your standard attack is your magic druid wand, which can send out a burst of druid energy straight ahead, and it works well enough, but it's also kinda slow, making for sluggish attacks on top of already sluggish movement. One neat thing that you do have though is this little floating orb thing that can also be used as a projectile attack, but it can also be used to grab items that are just out of reach. Unfortunately though, and you may be seeing a pattern here, it's also kind of slow and finicky to get it to do what you want it to do. Honestly, I just use it more as a thing to pick up spells with, since without it you have to walk over to them and then duck down to actually pick them up, and I hate when games make you do that. But the game's big back-of-the-box selling point is its whole magic system, which is admittedly pretty interesting whenever you look at it in the manual. Your character can find several magic spells laying around all the stages, and you have up to 9 slots to hold them all in, making it feel like you should have this crazy arsenal of magic the more you play. In practice though, you'll probably just have a bunch of healing potions, since that just seems like the one magic spell that the game's constantly trying to give you, probably because you're taking damage all the damn time. The rest of the spells like earthquakes and smart bombs aren't even as cool as they sound, since they only damage certain enemies or things in the stage. So you just kind of have to know that weak smart bombs only hurts living things, while the strong smart bombs just hurt the undead. The rest of the spells are just so rare that I only ever saw them like once while exploring, and honestly it wasn't worth the time spent finding them. And really, overall, the gameplay's it's kinda sad. It feels awful to move around in, your main attack is awkward and slow, and the whole magic system barely makes a difference besides just using your entire inventory for healing potions. The stages themselves can be fairly large, making you explore pretty much every corner to find those runestones, but thanks to the repetitive enemies and just generally uninteresting switch-throwing puzzles, I just kinda got tired of finding my way through them. Those enemies populating the stages are at least fun to look at, just like they were on the back of the box, but they're not any fun to kill. They usually take way too many hits or just keep respawning over and over again, and the game loves to put you in a gauntlet of them back to back to back. So besides the graphics and just the overall dark atmosphere of the game, there's just nothing keeping you from turning this off after a few stages. Warlock is just a really weird Super Nintendo release, not only for the fact that it's based around a horror movie that kids didn't even care about, but that it got released at all. Like, was LJN just desperate at this point to use up whatever licenses it had at the time? Because I can tell you right now that no one was asking for a Warlock game. Because even without the Warlock license, and honestly, who cares, this would have at least been a neat little spooky action-adventure game with some fun magic if it wasn't just so damn annoying to play. Like I said, it's got some great moody settings, and I do love the whole dark fantasy vibe of the whole thing, but everything else about this game is just firmly in the not very fun category. It's to the point where this game's actually making me want to recommend someone watch the movies rather than play this game. But I mean, honestly, just don't do either of those, since it's probably best to just never resurrect this Warlock again in any form. And finally, we've got Casper for the SNES. Now, I'm actually gonna bet that like half of you had no idea that this game even came out on the Super Nintendo. Probably thanks to it releasing in 1996, which I think a lot of us kids would classify as around the same time as when we started handing off our Genesises and our Super Nintendos to our little brothers, since a lot of kids had just moved on to the Sega, Saturn, and PlayStation by then. And if you're thinking, well, maybe they were just bringing this out for when the movie was released. Well, not really, since Casper the movie came out the year prior. But I will say that I was a fan of that movie. I actually remember going to see this one with my family when it was first released, and I thought it was a pretty fun little movie. Casper himself looked awesome with all that new CGI, and the whole thing had this creepy, almost Tim Burton atmosphere to it, especially the mansion. Now, I will admit that I have not seen Casper since then, so I have no idea if it still holds up these days. But at the time, I thought it was a fun trip to the theater.
You guys are disgusting, obnoxious creeps.
Thank you.
Now you might be asking yourself, well, how would that actually hold up as a video game? Well, first off, you're probably not actually asking that, but I'm going to tell you anyway, and it's not very well. But more on that here in a second. As for the box though, I mean, well, it's Casper, and you can't really go wrong with that. If you were a fan of the movie and you saw this on the shelf at your video store, then I think this would at least get you to pick it up. But the back of the box, it may actually make you put it back down, because what on earth is going on over here? There's like this bright green border slapped on top of all these super cropped in screenshots, to the point that you can't even tell what you're actually looking at. You'd have no idea what this game's even about just going by these alone. But let's just say that not even this could keep you from renting everyone's favorite friendly ghost. Well, get ready for something that's even more terrifying than anything in the actual movie. Man, I don't even really know where to start with this one. Casper isn't your typical licensed game. It's not a platformer, and it's definitely not an action game. Instead, it's more like Rocco's Modern Life on the Super Nintendo. One of those games where you kind of have to sorta guide the thing that you're babysitting through the level. But even that really doesn't properly describe this game, since it's also like a Metroidvania/puzzle game. It's just a big old weird mess of a game. But basically what you do in the game is you take control of Casper as you lead Cat through the mansion. You do this by leading her through various rooms, fighting off enemies, and solving puzzles. And all of these relies on Casper's ability to change into different objects, which you have to find first, since just about every new form will either be able to take out a certain enemy or a boss, along with other forms that are meant for Cat to get into new areas of the mansion. And that's all you do through the entire game, and really it's not that bad on its own. Even Cat herself is one of the less annoying things to babysit in these kind of games, since she'll usually duck out of harm's way or just not progress until you clear a path that she can walk to. But it's just doing all these things that makes Casper so damn annoying. And first, let's just take a look at what you'll be doing the most in the game, which is flying around and dealing with the other haunted crap that's in the mansion. Casper himself controls like a floating bathtub, with you constantly having to under and overcorrect your movement just to get him to go where you want him to go. On top of that, you've got the enemies in the game, like flying books, flying fruit, and just other flying crap that's coming at you so fast that you have no time to react at all. Sometimes you'll just walk into a new screen and get hit immediately. And it's not even really about dodging them, because then you have to cycle through your various forms just to find the one that'll defeat whatever's flying around, since it's not just one single form that takes out the enemies. Like how the flying books need the net to catch them, or the fruit needs the spatula to knock them off the screen. And usually by the time you find the form you need and then do the slow animation to change into it, you've taken even more hits. But even if you do manage to do all that pretty quick, you've then gotta actually contend with how annoying it is just to deal with the stuff that's coming at you. Since all of the enemies are just kind of flying and bouncing around all over the place, you've gotta manage to control Casper's slow-ass self just to get him in front of him and then hope that you hit him. And some of his forms, like the spatula, are so damn tiny that it's almost impossible to line up and hit the stuff that you need to hit. You also have to deal with the game's sort of boss encounters, which are Casper's three brothers, Stinky, Stretch, and Fatso. And these guys usually show up in certain rooms, and like everything else, they all take their own individual Casper form to beat him. Stinky needs the perfume to shoot into his mouth every time he burps, which is easier said than done. Fatso has you shooting him as he bounces around the room, and Stretch needs a plunger to the face to take him down. It's always the same fight too, but I'd rather be fighting these guys than yet another room full of bouncing fruit. So the action and controls are terrible. Well, how about exploring the mansion and just getting around it? Well, honestly, that's not too bad. It's probably the most enjoyable thing about the whole game. Exploring the mansion and finding the new forms to get past obstacles in your way is rewarding enough, but trying to remember where you need to go or just backtrack to is the worst part of the whole thing. Because in case you haven't noticed yet, there's not much variety to the mansion. It seems like there's maybe like half a dozen different backgrounds to go through in the entire game, so it all just kind of starts to blur together after a little while. Plus, the map screen's so small that it really doesn't help things much. But I will say that if you can manage the bad controls and constant annoying enemy encounters, then finding your way through the mansion can be fun. But really, that's about it. I'm not lying when I say there's almost nothing new that happens after like the first 15 minutes of playing this game, since by then you've found most of the forms and have seen pretty much every puzzle that the game's gonna throw at you. It's just gonna do it over and over again. And at that point, it's mostly just about you finding your way through the mansion and enduring it all, the latter of which is probably the hardest part of the whole game. It's definitely a weird one and kind of interesting just due to that, but overall, unless you just like really punishing puzzle adventure games, I think you could probably leave Casper here to roam his mansion by himself. Alright, first up, let's talk about a game that I think a lot of people kind of slept on, and honestly I can't really blame them. Captain Commando hit the Super Nintendo back in 1995, which is a port of their arcade game of the same name. And if you were a kid with a Super Nintendo back in the mid-90s, there's a decent chance that you never even saw this one on the shelf, and we'll get into why in just a second. But if you did happen to see this one at your local video store and you could get past some of Capcom's worst box art since Mega Man, you would have probably had an okay time with this one. So first, a little context. As mentioned, Captain Commando actually started life as an arcade game back in 1991. The same year, a little game called Street Fighter II came out as well, a game that was about to transform arcades for the next decade. And to be fair, I don't think anyone knew just how big Street Fighter II was about to be. In the meantime though, Captain Commando came out with the same wave of Capcom brawlers that was doing the rounds around that time, like King of Dragons and Knights of the Round. Except instead of going the whole gang warfare or fantasy route, this one leaned really hard into comic book territory, a really weird comic book. Unsurprisingly, Captain Commando just never hit it big in the arcades for obvious reasons. It didn't even do as well as the other beat-em-ups that I just mentioned. But Capcom loved to bring their lesser-known arcade games to the Super Nintendo. Here's the thing though, the game didn't actually make it to the Super Nintendo until 1995, 4 years after the arcade version. And by that point, the Super Nintendo was basically heading into its twilight years. Beat-em-ups in general had already kind of cooled off just due to oversaturation. So this thing just didn't ever get a lot of attention anywhere, arcade or Super Nintendo. Gameplay-wise, this is basically just your classic Capcom brawler. You get an attack button, a jump button, and each character has their own super move as well. But what makes this one stand out over the rest of an ocean of similar games is just how weird all the characters you can play as are. The most normal of the bunch is Captain Commando himself, who comes equipped with energy gloves that let you electrify floors if too many enemies are around. You also get Ginzu the Ninja, who mostly just kinda does ninja stuff. But then things start taking a really hard turn with Mac the Knife, who is, what I can gather, is just an alien who looks like a mummy and fights with knives. And last but certainly not least, you get Babyhead, which is a baby piloting a mech suit just because Capcom was definitely on some shit back in the early 90s. And overall, the rest of the game is just as wacky, with stages set in a circus tent death match, a museum where you're fighting cavemen, and then racing across the river on a surfboard trying to catch a mad scientist. And this is just the stuff that I miss in games like this. The game obviously isn't trying to take itself seriously. It's just a fun, silly beat-em-up that's more concerned with giving you a bunch of crazy stages to beat dudes up in than anything else. There's a total of 9 of them though, which sounds like it could be a slog to get through, but most of them are actually pretty short, so you're just breezing through a lot of this game, and that is not a bad thing. The game's biggest problem, though, is that this version of the game just feels a little not up to Capcom standards, because the Super Nintendo version is not the full arcade experience, and if you're the type of person who cares about that kind of thing, you're gonna notice here. The arcade original supported up to 4 players at once, but the Super Nintendo version is understandably cut down to 2 players, but it gets worse from there. There's way less enemies on the screen at any given time, and the graphics and animations got trimmed way back here. It just kind of looks dingy and muted compared to the arcade's way more colorful look. And this is probably a big one for fans of the original. The rideable mechs that you could hop into in the arcade game have been completely removed here, even though on the back of the box it's listed as one of the game's bullet points. And overall, the game just kind of feels slower and more sluggish compared to the arcade game, and that's usually not the kind of product that Capcom would deliver on the Super Nintendo. But even when Capcom is just phoning something in, it's still a pretty good Super Nintendo game, and judged on its own terms, it's okay. But going by all of that, is Captain Commando for the Super Nintendo still worth your time today? Well, I mean, if you grew up with it, then absolutely, sure. There's still some real charm here. But if you're coming into this fresh with no nostalgia attached at all, I don't think it's going to do much to impress you, especially on the Super Nintendo. And since that original Super Nintendo cartridge is gonna be pretty pricey to track down these days, you should probably just play the original arcade version on the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle. And that's probably the definitive way to play it these days. Plus, you get a bunch of other fun brawlers to play that defined that whole era, at least until Street Fighter II came in and blew everything up. Either way though, Captain Commando deserves a bit more love than it's gotten over the years. It's a weird, mostly forgotten relic of Capcom's early 90s beat-em-up craze. Next up, let's talk about a game where you play as what appears to be a Dollar General version of Indiana Jones, along with a few other vaguely 80s action hero looking guys, with your job being to punch evil animal poachers in the face to save endangered wildlife, with rocket launchers. This is G.R.O.W.L, and this one's made by Taito and came out on the Genesis back in 1991. And I'm pretty confident most of you have never even heard of it, which is both a shame and probably for the best. It's a really weird game, but this is one of those weird beat-em-ups where I don't think its overall weirdo credibility can save it, at least the Genesis version. G.R.O.W.L, of course, started out as an arcade game in 1990 from Taito, the same folks behind Space Invaders, Bubble Bobble, and a bunch of other arcade classics from the time. In Japan, it was called Run Arc, but over here, we got the title of G.R.O.W.L, which is a pretty cool name, IMO. The arcade version is actually a lot of fun. Up to 4 players could beat poachers to death all you wanted, and the action was actually pretty wild. While most games like this were just content to throw 3 or 4 dudes on the screen at any given time, G.R.O.W.L was tossing out like a dozen at a time. It's actually kind of crazy to see this many enemies coming at you in a beat 'em up. It also had this genuinely unusual premise at the heart of it. You play as a PAWS agent, which stands for Protectors of Animals World Society, and you're here to absolutely destroy anyone that's messing with the local wildlife. And for the better or worse, the game leaned really hard into that theme, ending up with what looks like an over-the-top 80s action flick centered around saving baby elephants and other wildlife. And I'm spending a lot of time on the arcade version because I want you to know that that version is a lot of fun. It's fast-paced, chaotic, and it's absolutely hilarious. The Genesis port, though, well, it came out in 1991, and right out of the gate, it made one decision that hurt it more than almost anything else. The 4-player co-op mode is completely gone. Again, that's understandable. Not too many games came out with 4-player co-op anything back then. But they didn't even give you 2-player simultaneous play here. That's right, this is a single-player only beat-em-up for a genre that lives and dies on couch co-op, and unfortunately, that ain't the only bad thing about it. While the arcade version of G.R.O.W.L featured some fairly solid action, the Genesis version just feels not great. It still has a ton of enemies on screen at times, but the act of actually hitting any of them feels awful. There's nothing that makes you feel like you're connecting any attacks unless the guy just kind of falls backwards or something. It feels like you're swinging at air most of the time, and thanks to the multitude of dudes constantly surrounding you at any given time, it's really easy to get locked in place with no way to fight back. At least the game still gives you the crazy amount of pickups from the arcade game. The arsenal in this game is just absurd for what you'd usually get in one of these kinds of games. You've got your melee stuff like pipes, swords, a whip, which is the best weapon in the game by the way, but then you can also pick up stuff like pistols, rifles, rocket launchers, and grenades. You can even beat people up with the guns when you run out of ammo. So even if punching guys feels totally lame in this version, there's usually at least something scattered around on the ground to try and make up for it. The other big hook in the game are the animals. As you move through each stage, you'll come across captured wildlife. If you free them, they'll fight alongside you for a minute. Eagles will swoop down and attack enemies, deer stampede through the screen, and if you're lucky enough to rescue an elephant, it will absolutely trample everything in its path. This is probably the coolest gimmick in the whole game, and I just wish it was used more, because the game desperately needs the action broken up more often. Besides that though, there's not really much else going on here. There's usually a good amount of stuff to interact with in the stages, and that would be great if the Genesis port didn't also slow down the attack speed compared to the arcade, which means you're trading hits with enemies way more than you'd actually want to. It's just so slow compared to the arcade, and without a friend playing next to you, it really drags. Oh, and before I forget it, the Genesis version also removed a really awful platforming section in a cave that was in the arcade, and replaced it with an equally awful cave level where you can't see shit. So definitely choose your poison with that one. So what are we left with here? Well, the Genesis port is thinner than the arcade version in basically every single way, and playing it solo in 2026, you are going to feel the repetition. But is it worth experiencing? Well, I mean, yeah, for the right person. If you like games that tried something different, G.R.O.W.L has a lot of that going on. The animal rescue gimmick is neat in a way that still holds up today, at least with how funny it is. The weapons are ridiculous and there's tons of them, and just the overall setting and theme of the game is really unique. I mean, how many other games out there can you name where you're rescuing animals from poachers that are controlled by an alien? Oh, did I forget to mention that part? Oh, well, there you go. It's one of those games that I think is way more fun to talk about and show people than it is to sit down and grind through it alone for an hour or so. Show someone the elephant stampede and maybe the alien exploding out of the last boss, and you've pretty much got the full G.R.O.W.L experience. Or just play the arcade version because that one is legit fun. But fair warning though, the original Genesis carts are very expensive these days since it was a limited release. The arcade version though is available on Untitled Legends 2, and that is the way to go if you want the fuller experience complete with co-op. Overall though, I mean, G.R.O.W.L's still a weird little footnote in Genesis history, and I'm one of those weird people that can fully appreciate that. And lastly, let's talk about a game where you play as a regular guy. You've already survived 2 absolutely nightmarish encounters with supernatural evil, but you've escaped, you've saved your girlfriend, and you put the whole thing behind you. You got married, had a kid, bought a mansion in Connecticut, and got into finance. And yes, that's actually part of the story. You were done with all that monster stuff. But then, wouldn't you know it, the monsters show up at your house. And that's Splatterhouse 3 in a nutshell. This is one of those games that I think a lot of Genesis owners remember fondly, but has mostly been kind of forgotten over the years. But first, for the few of you that somehow don't know what this series even is, Splatterhouse blew up as an arcade game in 1988 from Namco. And the whole premise was basically an 80s slasher movie in video game form.
Splatterhouse.
But instead of running from the monsters, you are the monster. Sorta. You play as Rick, a college student who puts on a very familiar looking hockey mask that takes control of you so that you can absolutely destroy the army of the undead that's standing in your way to save your girlfriend Jennifer. It was actually pretty crazy for the time for just how over the top and gory it was, because not too many games were doing this kind of thing back then. The first home version landed on the TurboGrafx 16, to the excitement of the 7 or so people that actually owned the TurboGrafx. The second game came out of the Genesis, which gave Namco a lot more freedom to just be themselves. Sega at the time had this whole "we're the edgy one" thing going on for the Genesis, so the gloves just really came off on the gore front, ending up with a game that's actually still pretty gross even by today's standards. By the time Splatterhouse 3 came out in 1993, the series had built up a pretty decent cult following, and this third entry was clearly Namco trying to do something a little bit more ambitious. It was one of the first games that actually received Sega's MA13 rating, their version of a mature content warning before the ESRB existed. So even by the standards of the day, this game was already pushing things. And as soon as you start playing Splatterhouse 3, things get pretty interesting, because it's not just a side-scroller like the first 2 games. The whole thing takes place inside Rick's mansion, and each level is a floor of the house. You get a map and you plot your way through each room to make it to the boss. There are dead ends, branching paths, shortcuts. The whole mansion's got this maze-like quality to it all that felt pretty unique for a brawler back in 1993. But you can't just explore at your own pace. As the intro to the game says, you can't just wander, I think it actually means wander, around the house since there's actually a time limit. Each floor has a clock counting down, and whether you make it to the boss in time directly affects the story and how you progress through the game. If you run out of time, then bad things are going to happen to your family. Jennifer can just straight up die in stage 2. Your son David can also be taken as well. And knowing that the clock is always running actually adds some real tension to what would otherwise be a pretty standard punch-everything experience. But sometimes that timer doesn't tell you everything, and stage 2 is where it gets nasty. There's a hidden deadline inside the stated deadline. Jennifer is effectively beyond saving once the clock hits 2 minutes, not 0. You need to already be in the boss room before it hits that mark. Most players won't know this on a first run. Hell, I didn't even know this for years after the fact. The game doesn't tell you at all. On top of that, clearing a stage fast enough can actually change which stage you play next. The timer's so baked into the story logic that your pace through each floor shifts the entire path that you take. It's a pretty cool idea, but I just wish there was a little better explanation for what times you need to hit to get to where you need to go. Because if you don't know what you're doing, it just kind of seems like it happens at random. As for actually playing it, Rick himself feels a lot better than the earlier games. He's got actual combos this time, along with a spin kick that takes some practice to pull off, but becomes essential if you want to hit those required times. And also the ability to transform into a bigger, meatier version of himself once you collect power orbs. Monster Rick hits harder, takes less damage, and replaces his spin kick with meat sticks that shoots out of his torso. It's also really hard. The enemies can take you down pretty fast, and the bosses in particular are the kind that makes you put the controller down and just stare at the wall for a few minutes before you try again. But the biggest enemy by far in the game is the time limit, since you just cannot screw around for too long if you want to get out before it hits 0. It never really feels unfair, but it's definitely the kind of game where you feel like you're getting better each time you start over, and you will be starting over. But besides the gameplay, what makes Splatterhouse 3 feel different from basically everything on the Genesis is the atmosphere. This game fully commits to its horror theme. The story is told through digitized cutscenes between levels and even during the levels. Real actors, real costumes, and a really creepy presentation for what it actually is. It gives the whole thing this cheesy but effective tone that feels exactly like an 80s horror movie, which is absolutely the point. The monsters range from headless zombies and weird, giant, fleshy fetus-looking things to stuff like a teddy bear boss that has a monster inside of it that just kind of looks like it was made from a bunch of meat and claws. And I always really love the boar worm boss that just looks gross on its own, but then it bursts open with a bunch of maggots when its health gets too low. And I mean, for the time, this was some pretty gross stuff. The story itself is also better than you'd expect from a game like this. Rick and Jennifer's relationship has actual weight to it by this point. You're not just punching monsters for the hell of it here, you're trying to save your family. And the ending, if you can make it that far, has a pretty dark twist involving the Terror Mask that I'm not gonna be spoiling here. But is it worth playing these days to see that ending? Well, I mean, yeah, it's actually still pretty cool. It's not winning any awards, the combat's repetitive, the time limit is just brutal, and it can be pretty frustrating. But as a package, it holds up better than a lot of other beat-em-ups from the time. The open exploration of the mansion, the weird timer stuff, the multiple endings and ways to get through the mansion, there's more going on here than you'd think from a game called Splatterhouse. But just like all the games in today's video, this one gets pretty expensive if you want that cartridge. And sadly, there really isn't a convenient way to play it these days, with its only real re-release being available as an unlockable in the 2010 Splatterhouse reboot for the Xbox 360 and PS3. And that kind of sucks, because Splatterhouse 3 deserves to be played more. It's weird and dark and surprisingly thoughtful for a game that started out as just an excuse to let players run around in a Jason mask and kill monsters with a 2x4. This one's actually pretty good stuff, folks. Check it out if you haven't. First up, we're gonna start with the most famous failure in this whole video.
I like it.
Bubsy the Bobcat is the poster child for pretty much everything the early 90s got wrong about mascot design. He's just one of those characters that never met a one-liner that he didn't immediately start spouting out.
What could possibly go wrong?
And Bubsy II, which came out in 1994 for both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, is the game that was supposed to prove that he deserved the hype. Unfortunately for Bubsy though, it just kind of proved that he didn't deserve the hype, even if it is a better and more interesting game than the first one. The original Bubsy came out back in 1993 from Accolade, and believe it or not, it actually sold really well, which probably had something to do with the fact that this Bobcat was pretty much plastered all over gaming magazines back then. Reviews for the game were mixed at best, but sales were actually strong enough that Accolade immediately greenlit a sequel, a Game Boy version, and believe it or not, an animated pilot, an actual cartoon episode that aired on Fox in 1993 as a test for a potential Bubsy cartoon series, because that was apparently what all of us kids were wanting at the time. The pilot itself featured Bubsy making approximately 47 jokes in 22 minutes, and at no point does anything that happens in the pilot suggest that a full series was a good idea, and Fox happened to agree with that.
Do we have to go through this every single morning?
The sequel was actually designed by Cindy Kirkpatrick, and the working title for the game during development was Bubsy II Still No Pants. The final title is the more conservative Bubsy 2, which tells you the marketing department eventually got involved. The structure for the game is actually kind of ambitious this time. Where the first game was more of a linear stage progression, Bubsy 2 is instead set inside a giant museum called the Amazatorium. You start in a lobby hub and choose which wing that you want to tackle, and the levels branch out from there. It's definitely more open than anything the first game attempted, and on paper gives Bubsy 2 more structure and replayability than most mascot platformers from the time. And if you play the original, you'll probably feel right at home here. But Bubsy's moveset did get an upgrade for the sequel. The biggest probably being that he can now take 3 hits before dying, which is a huge change from the original's brutal one-hit deaths that made the first game feel unfair in ways that had nothing to do with skill. Though the game does have a ton of obstacles that'll kill you in one hit, so you still gotta watch out. Bubsy still has his glide ability for crossing long gaps, and there's now power-ups scattered throughout the levels that Bubsy can actually use this time. Stuff like a Nerf gun that actually gives you a projectile attack, and even an underwater suit that lets you go underwater instead of dying in one hit to puddles on the floor. Keeping the positive train rolling, the levels in the game actually have a really good amount of variety and include stuff like medieval castles, outer space, ancient Egypt, whatever this is, and actually a ton more. Say what you will about that first Bubsy game, but it did have a good amount of variety throughout the entire game, and Bubsy II easily tops that. And that includes the crazy amount of mini-games that you'll find in each level, like rolling through tubes as an armadillo, blasting frogs across a lake for points, and even using that aforementioned diving suit to navigate underwater sections. So coming into this, if you were just wanting more Bubsy, Bubsy II definitely gives it to you, for better and worse. But this is Bubsy, and you know it's not going to be all good news. And unfortunately, 2 of its biggest issues from the first game come back to haunt it here. The first being that Bubsy still just moves too damn fast. He still does that weird thing where he'll walk at a normal pace for a second, and then he'll just bust into a full-on sprint the next, leading to you constantly starting and stopping just so he doesn't run full speed off of a cliff into yet another one-hit death. And the stages just aren't designed for that kind of speed, so I don't know why they kept it in the game. And that brings us to the level design. The levels themselves are huge, and sometimes just figuring out where to go is the biggest challenge in a level. And thanks to Bubsy getting blasted all over the place by random stuff, it gets really annoying. Also, sometimes the level design just doesn't make any sense, like going into a door that leads you one place and then going back through the same door that leads you to a totally different part. There are at least arrows pointing you in the direction that you're supposed to be going this time, but it still just kind of feels like luck whenever you do make it to the end of a stage. And we can't talk about Bubsy without mentioning just how much he talks, like constantly.
Do you believe in miracles?
He has over 200 voice samples in the Super Nintendo version, and he deploys them without mercy.
I win!
And it doesn't help that Bubsy has that specific nasal tone to him that gets old as soon as you hear it on the title screen.
I like it!
Still though, Bubsy 2 is a better game than the first Bubsy. The improvements to the game are nice, but the fundamental problem with Bubsy was never that it was a completely awful game. It was mainly due to the fact that the game asked you to spend time with Bubsy, and Bubsy's just exhausting. And as good as the first Bubsy sold, this one did not. Bubsy 2 was such a disappointment that Accolade actually brought back the original creator, Michael Berlin, for a third game, and decided the series needed a complete reinvention. That reinvention ended up being Bubsy 3D for the PlayStation in 1996, which is widely regarded as one of the worst 3D platformers ever made. But constant failure has never stopped Bubsy. In fact, Bubsy 4D just got released in 2026. It's kinda hard not to love this damn bobcat for trying, I guess. As for Bubsy 2 though, well, if you liked the first game and wanted something a little bit better, then this is probably worth playing. But for most people, this bobcat is probably better left for us weirdos that still enjoy his goofball nonsense. But having said all of that, I need you to understand one thing for this next game. Because as much mess as I just talked about Bubsy, Awesome Possum makes that game look like an all-time classic.
I'm awesome!
If Bubsy was the mascot who tried to out-Sonic Sonic through sheer personality, Awesome Possum took a different approach. He was going to out-Sonic Sonic and save the environment while he was doing so. He was going to be the first video game character ever to carry an actual ecological message alongside his attitude. And to top it off, he was going to have digitized speech that made Bubsy's voice look modest by comparison. Awesome Possum Kicks Dr. Machino's Butt, which, yes, that is the full name, came out for the Genesis in November of 1993. Developed and published by Tengen, this one ended up being one of the most concentrated examples of early 90s mascot hubris that's ever been committed to a cartridge. Back in 1992, Tengen hired designer Richard Seaborn specifically to develop an environmentally themed platformer. But this wasn't going to be just another tired mascot platformer. Instead, it was going to be a tired mascot platformer about saving the environment. Because, say it with me, kids,
Which was the style at the time?
but there was some logic to it because stuff like Captain Planet had been on TV since 1990 and been really popular. Plus, recycling campaigns were everywhere back then. And the idea of a conservation-themed kids platformer wasn't obviously a bad one. And personally, I don't think it's that bad of an idea either. It just turned out that everything else about this possum was a bad idea. The Sonic influence in Awesome Possum is not subtle at all. Awesome Possum runs fast, can turn into a spinning ball to attack enemies, and is fighting a mad scientist who's destroying the natural world. That's not this game's big problem, though. In fact, there were probably dozens of games copying Sonic at any given time.
Wow, that was incredible.
But this game's biggest problem, just look at it. First of all, the game only seems to be running at like 15 frames per second most of the time, making everything look really choppy, especially when you're moving as fast as this game seems to want you to move. And when you got controls this bad on top of all that, you've got one of the worst feeling games that I've ever touched. Like, this is up there with Bebe's Kids as far as how awful it feels to play. Awesome Possum slides across the ground, overshoots platforms constantly, and handles with a slipperiness that feels more accidental than intentional. Even just trying to jump on top of an enemy takes way more effort than you could ever imagine for what's supposed to be a basic mascot platformer. And the only thing that you can do in this game is jump. Like, literally, I'm not kidding, that's the only thing. Every button on the controller jumps. And just like Bubsy, Awesom's getting blasted all over these stages, usually directly into pits or enemies, with almost nothing that you can do to avoid it. Mainly thanks to the stage design just being a hodgepodge of platforms and pits. Also, we get the trifecta here, since there's no invincibility window whenever you take damage, which means that a cluster of enemies can drain your entire health bar in like 2 seconds with nothing that you can do about it.
Now you've gone and done it.
And you're doing all of this while this possum is constantly screeching one-liners at you.
All right.
Yes, just like Bubsy, Awesome talks a lot.
I'm awesome.
And he's somehow even more annoying than Bubsy, and I'm not sure how you can even manage that. He's constantly saying stuff like, "I'm so awesome," and "way past cool," and just dozens of other phrases that constantly mention his own greatness approximately every few seconds. Everything you do or pick up will cause Awesome to say something, and it's almost always the worst possible thing you could imagine someone saying. Admittedly, the sheer amount of digitized speech was nothing short of a technical achievement on a cartridge in 1993, but Tengen used that achievement to make Awesome Possum tell you how cool he is on a loop for the duration of every level.
That was incredible.
Thankfully, and I mean this genuinely, Tengen does give you the option to turn off the voice in the options menu. And I'm not kidding when I say that this is the most satisfying thing you can do in the entire game. But what about that whole environmental angle that the game is supposed to have? Well, Awesome is fighting against a bunch of robots that are dead set on destroying the environment, which, I mean, that's okay, it's not too bad. But the game actually goes out of its way to market itself as something that could educate kids about the environment. And just how did they get away with doing that? Well, they put a multiple choice quiz at the end of every single stage, asking you questions about recycling and pollution and all that stuff. Getting answers right gives you bonus points, which you don't need, and getting them wrong costs you absolutely nothing. The quiz only seems to exist because someone needed to justify its marketing, and this is what they came up with. Awesome Possum is probably the mascot war's most overcommitted casualty. Bubsy at least had a somewhat decent game underneath his personality. Awesome Possum, though, delighted everyone with bad controls on top of a nearly unplayable game, with a mandatory quiz at the end of every single stage. And if that wasn't bad enough, they put the loudest and most unlikable character possible as the main character.
Your heart out, Dr. Machino.
And to tell you just how much confidence Tengen had in this game, they released it in the Christmas holiday season of 1993. The same year when stuff like Aladdin, Mega Man X, and even Sonic CD came out. But I genuinely hope that none of you kids ended up with this game under the tree, because this Possum should be out in the dumpster where he belongs.
Keep your heart out, Dr. McDonald.
And finally, we got one whose tagline tells you everything you need to know before you even look at the box. Radical Rex, too hip to be extinct. He's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, he's on a skateboard, he breathes fire, and his girlfriend is named Rex-Ann. Radical Rex came out in October of 1994 for both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. Beam Software, the developer, was an Australian studio that had been making games since the early 80s, with stuff like Castle of Terror on the C64 being fairly well known at the time. They'd worked on licensed properties including Shadowrun for the Super Nintendo, and by then had a reasonable track record for the era. In 1993, Beam tossed out a little game called a Baby T-Rex for the Game Boy, which was actually tossed around to other publishers in an attempt to license it out as a licensed property, which actually ended up happening when High Tech turned Baby T-Rex into We're Back, A Dinosaur's Tale. But Activision was always hunting for something they could use to break into the mascot platformer market, and Baby T-Rex was just sitting there ready for a 16-bit glow-up. The transition from Baby T-Rex to Radical Rex involved adding the skateboard mechanic, giving the character fire breath attacks, and jamming enough tood into the game to embarrass even kids at the time. And to show you just how serious it was at being radical, the Super Nintendo version actually starts with a full-on rap, complete with lyrics. So please try not to cringe too hard as you listen to this.
Real cool Radical Rex.
Radical Rex.
He's so rad, he's my real cool Radical Rex.
For whatever reason, though, the rap was actually left out of the Genesis version, and whether that rap is something worth missing is a question that I'll let you decide. Get into the game though, and Radical Rex is pretty much exactly what you think it is. A side-scrolling platformer with a few various moves that you can do. Rex can breathe fire, which is his primary long-range attack that can also be upgraded into a projectile, and he's also got a jump kick for close-range combat, though it's barely useful as an attack because you're rarely in position to land it intentionally. To the point where the fire breath becomes the solution to almost everything because it's the only thing that works reliably. Of course, since you're extremely radical, you have your skateboard that you can find in certain sections for faster, more extreme ways to get through the stage. You also get a roar attack that hits everything on the screen at once and lasts longer the more charge you have. Plus, you collect eggs scattered through the levels for points and a bonus stage if you collect enough of them by the end of the level. And I hope any of this actually sounded fun to you, because this is basically all you're doing across all 10 stages in this game. The levels that you'll be doing all this stuff on are pretty okay, with your standard prehistoric locations like jungles and swamps, though there are some highlights like being able to navigate the inside of a dinosaur and a pretty neat dino graveyard that's heavy on the platforming. The skateboarding sections in the levels are probably some of the most fun, since if you can learn the right path through them, you can breeze through a lot of these levels pretty quickly. It's fast and actually kind of fun. I just wish there were more of them in the game. Also, it doesn't help that the difficulty in the game is on the easier side, which I imagine was for appealing to younger players, but for a character that was marketed to be too hip to be extinct, the game itself is a bit too breezy and cartoony for a lot of the attitude branding that's surrounding it. Also, there's one genuinely strange detail between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo versions, well, besides that rap. They've both got completely different villains. The Genesis version has you fighting Scritch, an evil gopher-like creature who wants mammals to rule the world and has cast a spell turning dinosaurs against each other. The Super Nintendo version has you fighting Sethron, a human wizard that's basically doing the same thing, so I'm not really sure why they changed it. And as far as I know, I don't think this has ever been explained. It's just a really weird change. But if there's one big issue with Radical Rex, it's just that it's fine. It looks decent and it plays okay. Radical Rex is the most inoffensive game in this entire video, which is almost the most damning thing that you can say about it. But what Radical Rex is, more than anything else, is just a game that arrived too late to the party that it was dressed for. For reference, Donkey Kong Country came out later that year in November and basically shut the whole mascots with attitude thing down on arrival. Radical Rex shipped into a market that was already looking for anything other than another tired mascot with attitude. At the very least, though, it's a hell of a time capsule for a time when all a game needed to exist was a rap about how cool you are. First up on the cartoon block is Batman and Robin for the Genesis, and this is one of those games that's just maddening to me for a variety of reasons, and if you've happened to have played it, then I'm pretty sure you already know why. But if you haven't, well, The Adventures of Batman and Robin came out in 1995 and was developed by a small studio called Clockwork Tortoise. And it's just one of the craziest Batman games out there. Not because it's bad, it's actually kind of neat in certain ways, but because almost nothing about it matches what you'd expect from a Batman game. And that turns out to be both its biggest problem and its most interesting quality as well. So let's just get into this one. Now, when most people talk about The Adventures of Batman and Robin as a video game, they're usually talking about the Super Nintendo version, which came out in 1994 from Konami, a game that we've actually already covered in another review. So if you want to check that one out, then go watch this video. But essentially, that one's a side-scrolling brawler. It looks and feels faithful to the cartoon, and it's generally well regarded. The Genesis version, though, is a completely different game from a completely different studio with completely different gameplay. Same name, same license, different everything else. And this happens way more than you'd think when you're going back between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and it caused endless confusion for us kids back then. As mentioned, the Genesis version was developed by Clockwork Tortoise, who you've probably never even heard of. They're mostly just known for two games, both Batman and both in 1995. This one and the Sega CD version. The development of the game was apparently not a smooth process. Clockwork Tortoise missed multiple milestones, and there's a persistent story that Sega itself had to step in to get this game finished in time for release. And I don't know if any of that's actually true or not, but it would explain a lot about this game. Gameplay-wise, the Genesis version is a run-and-gun, not a brawler like what you'd expect, but a run-and-gun in the same vein of, like, Contra. You walk to the right and you just shoot a bunch of weapons at all the waves of enemies that are constantly coming at you. Batman and Robin are, of course, both playable, but they're both identical, which is either streamlined or just lazy depending on your tolerance for that kind of thing. The weapon system, though, does at least have a little bit of depth to it. You've got 3 projectile types, batarangs, bolas, and bat stars, and each one can be powered up by collecting the same symbol multiple times. There's also a charge shot mechanic where just holding off on firing for a second builds up a stronger blast that can shoot through multiple targets. But I'm gonna tell you right now that you hardly ever have time to do that because you're just constantly holding that fire button down. Besides that, there's not much else to the gameplay. Batman can jump and do various kicks, but you'll probably be using that more just to get away from all the enemies that are constantly swarming you. The visuals, though, are really impressive. This is a late-era Genesis game, and Clockwork Tortoise clearly knew the hardware. Parallax scrolling is everywhere. Scaling effects, bosses that take up significant chunks of the screen with zero slowdown. The sprites even look really good, and the cutscenes are clearly from people who loved the show. And there's even stuff like a top-down shooter stage with what looks like 3D buildings scrolling around underneath you as you fly. This is straight up one of the best looking Genesis games ever made. The problem is that you'll probably never actually see any of those cool stages because the game is just brutal. Genuinely almost unreasonably hard. Stages go on forever, enemies spawn in constantly, and you have limited continues with no save system. And this is one of those games where the enemies will just melt your health bar before you even realize it. The difficulty isn't precision-based in the satisfying way like Contra. This is just more attrition. You die, you restart the stage, and you hopefully memorize the patterns for you to try again, and again, and again. I cannot overstate just how relentlessly difficult this game is. Without cheats, finishing this game is a serious badge of honor. More than one reviewer at the time said it was one of the hardest games that they'd ever played, and take it from me, that is not hyperbole. But if there is one universally praised thing about this whole game, that's the music. We gotta talk about this music. The soundtrack is composed by Jesper Kyd, who at this point had done Subterranea and Red Zone for the Genesis, both known for pushing the hardware's sound chip in unusual directions. What he delivered here, though, would go on to become the most talked about thing in the entire game. The crazy thing is, though, the soundtrack sounds nothing like Batman the Animated Series. The show has a moody, jazzy orchestral score that was closer to something like Danny Elfman in the movies. The Kyd, though, just went in a completely different direction stylistically, and the soundtrack ended up being like this dark electronic music that you'd expect to hear at a goth rave. And it's legitimately great music that has almost no business existing in this form on a 16-bit cartridge in 1995. Kyd, of course, would go on to make music for the Hitman series and Assassin's Creed, but you can definitely hear the beginnings of that style right here in Batman and Robin. But besides that soundtrack, how does this thing hold up these days? Well, it would be a total recommendation, but the difficulty just kills this game. It's a technical showcase for sure for the late Genesis hardware, and it needs to be seen to be believed at times. And as a piece of video game music history, the Jesper Kyd soundtrack is essential listening on its own. Just pull it up on YouTube and let it run, and you've basically got the best thing about this whole game. Overall, though, the game got middling reviews when it came out, but it did slowly build a sort of cult following among the people who were patient enough to actually spend some time with it. But for most people, I think the Super Nintendo version is the safer recommendation if you just want something that feels like the show. The Genesis version is the one that you track down when you want something completely different. They're both worth your time, but Batman and Robin on the Genesis is gonna make you work for it. Next up is Spider-Man the Animated Series for the Super Nintendo, and as you may have guessed, you play as Spider-Man in this game. A character whose entire identity is built around acrobatic movement, web-slinging through skyscrapers, and sticking to just about any surface. And in this game, you can barely do any of those things. The wall crawling only works on certain surfaces, the web swing has a mind of its own, and of course, the whole thing was published by LJN, which if you know, then you know. Spider-Man the Animated Series came out in 1995 and was developed by Western Technologies and published by LJN. And it's one of those rare games about being Spider-Man that consistently makes you feel like you're not Spider-Man. It's just really frustrating, and we're gonna get into it right now. The game is of course based on the cartoon Spider-Man the Animated Series that ran on Fox Kids from 1994 to 1998. And that was actually a genuinely good cartoon. It had some good storytelling, a huge roster of villains, and surprisingly mature themes for a Saturday morning cartoon. Just like the X-Men the Animated Series, it had some ambition going for it, even if it did make Peter Parker into this buff jock-looking guy. It also had, famously, some not too great animation choices, especially involving some of the worst CGI the mid-90s could produce. But overall, the show was pretty good, and a lot of kids grew up with it. The game arrived in 1995, right in the middle of the show's run, which should have been a hit on the Super Nintendo for kids wanting some more Spider-Man action. And while the publisher was LJN, it was technically a subsidiary of Acclaim by that point, but that rainbow logo still carried weight in 1995, and not the good kind. But to be fair to this game, it's not the worst thing LJN ever published, not by a long shot, but it's still not a very good Spider-Man game. The Super Nintendo version is a side-scrolling platformer across 6 levels, and Spider-Man can do exactly what you'd want Spider-Man to be able to do. Punches, kicks, wall crawling, web swinging, web projectiles, and even the ability to call in members of the Fantastic Four if you can find them. The game's obviously trying to do a little bit more than your standard Spider-Man game, and it is the bones of something that could have been good. The problem is that most of it just doesn't work the way it should. The wall crawling only functions on specific surfaces with no clear visual indication of which ones that you can actually climb, leading to a lot of moments where you're just jumping at stuff hoping you can stick to it. The web swinging is also very inconsistent due to how perfectly aligned with the ceiling you need to be whenever you need to use it. There's actually a level early on the Brooklyn Bridge that's specifically built around web slinging, and the web just has its own ideas about when it will and will not attach to that damn bridge. There's also this weird thing the game does where it has two planes to each level, most of the time, the foreground and the background, but it's extremely hard to tell when you can or should transition between the two. It's especially annoying when there's stuff you need to attach to and you just have no idea which plane it's on unless you just take a jump at it and hope for the best. The construction yard in particular is an absolute nightmare to get through because of this, and that's just stage 2. The controls basically have two speeds, a walk and a run triggered by holding the same L button that you use for wall crawling. And if you haven't already noticed, this game has a huge pet peeve of mine where you walk way too close to the edge of the screen and you just can't see anything that's coming up at you. And as soon as you start running, you are guaranteed to end up straight into an enemy or a pit before you can even know it's there. And the icing on the cake is that the combat doesn't save any of this. Your basic punch and kicks work well enough, but the hit detection against enemies in this game is just completely weird throughout the whole game. Bosses especially. You'll be right in their face swinging away and genuinely have no idea if you're doing any damage or not. And for a game with this many damn bosses, that's kind of a problem. And I think that's the core problem with this whole game. Spider-Man's moveset only works when the game decides it can work, and that inconsistency basically screws up everything else. Because when your controls are unreliable, you stop experimenting with them. You stop trying to swing around or scale walls to find new creative ways around the level. You just walk forward and punch things and hope that the game doesn't decide to toss you into a damn pit again, which is pretty much the opposite of what a Spider-Man game should feel like. At least the game gives you a bunch of villains, since that roster is actually kind of impressive. Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, the Alien Spider Slayer, and Venom as the final boss. Plus a whole parade of sub-bosses including like the Lizard and Rhino, plus a bunch more. So at least the game does give you a bunch of villains to beat up, but none of them are actually fun to fight, so it's just kind of a wash. All of this combined makes the game feel like the opposite of a Spider-Man game. He doesn't even look like Spider-Man. They didn't even make him like the buff Spider-Man from the cartoon. Instead, he's like this squat little short guy that looks like he wandered into someone's Halloween party. It's just not what you want in this kind of game. And by now, I think you should be able to figure out that Spider-Man the Animated Series is not worth checking out these days. The game, I mean. The cartoon's actually still a lot of fun to watch. But the game, the controls just suck the fun out of playing as Spider-Man. And when your entire premise is be Spider-Man, that's a significant problem. I guess at least you can kind of see what they were trying to do here. It really did try to bring a lot of the show's charm into the game, but then you bump into the wall crawling not working and the web swing just deciding to have the day off, and it just ruins the whole experience. It may have some good intentions and ideas, but almost everything about the game's design is just bad. Loose carts are at least cheap and easy to find, which is probably the correct price. And if you played this as a kid and remember it fondly, then I'm sure some of that nostalgia still holds up these days. But if you're coming in fresh, then probably something like Maximum Carnage or even the later Neversoft PlayStation 1 games are gonna give you a better time. This one's at least worth trying just to see how hard it is to make Spider-Man feel like Spider-Man, and when it can go really wrong when someone fails at that. The cartoon got it right, and future Spider-Man games would perfect it, but this one, along with most of the rest of LJN's published games, are best left in the past. And finally, let's take a look at a game where you play as a hideously deformed mutant that fights bad guys with a mop, and your name is Toxie. This is Toxic Crusaders, and it came out on the NES and Genesis back in 1992. The NES version was published by Bandai, and the Genesis version was published by Sega. And both of them are based on a cartoon that was based on a trauma movie, a film that was never meant for children in any sort of way. That's 3 levels of licensing decisions that probably should have stopped with the first one, but they weren't, and here we are. To understand the Toxic Crusaders, you need to know a little bit about the Toxic Avenger. That's the 1984 Troma movie, a low-budget, extremely gross, very violent movie about a nerdy janitor who falls into a vat of toxic waste and becomes a monstrous superhero. It's a cult classic, everybody loves Toxic Avenger, but it is emphatically not a kids' movie. So naturally, in 1991, someone looked at that and said, what if we made a kids cartoon about that? And the cartoon, Toxic Crusaders, ran for 13 whole episodes. But the cartoon, of course, softened basically every edge off the movie and added a whole team of other mutant companions to help Toxie fight against pollution.
Which was the style at the time.
And if you got a cartoon, then you obviously need a game, and that followed in 1992. You had an NES version and a Genesis version as mentioned, and they're actually pretty different games despite sharing a name and similar premise. The NES version is a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The Genesis version is also a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The distinction between the two is that the Genesis version is really, really bad. So obviously, we're going to be taking a look at that Genesis version because even though it's teeth-gratingly bad, it's at least kind of funny with how bad it is. Getting into the game, and you've actually got 3 different characters that you can play as, though you might be mistaken for not even really realizing that. You get to pick from Toxie, No Zone, and Junkyard. All of them are from the cartoon, at least as far as I'm aware. But to play as anyone other than Toxie, you have to go into the options screen and change it there. And for whatever reason, if you're playing 2-player co-op, one of you has to be Toxie regardless. It's one of the weirdest ways to handle character select in a brawler, and we haven't even started the game yet. So this is a beat-em-up, technically, but it may just be the worst feeling beat-em-up that I've ever come across. I know I've mentioned that with a couple of games on this channel, but they just keep coming somehow. In this one, the controls are so squirrely that it's almost impossible to feel like you're in control at any point. You skate, sometimes literally, all over the screen. It's like someone put your character on ice and then just attached a rubber band to him as well. If you can manage to stand still, it's at least somewhat doable, but moving around feels so bad that certain stages are just damn near unplayable. And you know what's a great thing to add into your game with controls that bad? One-hit deaths. Lots of them. There are so many instant kill obstacles in this game that half the time you're dead before you even know what happened. And given how the controls are just constantly flinging you around the screen, a lot of those deaths are just gonna happen. And the sad thing is, you kinda just get used to it at some point. But let's just say you can wrangle Toxie for a few minutes. Well, the act of actually hitting dudes with your mop ain't that great either, but it's at least serviceable. You get 2 attack buttons, which is supposed to equate to short and long attacks, but it's honestly hard to tell since Toxie just seems to do like whatever the hell he wants at times. There are some nice touches here and there, like being able to whack your little sidekick with a golf ball if he gets close to you, and cleaning up enemies with your mop after they melt away. That is a nice touch. But there's no time where any of this feels good to play. This is just historically bad controls in a video game. But hold on there, because we're not actually done. Because this game also saw fit to throw in one of the most convoluted item pickup systems that I've ever seen in a beat-em-up. I actually made the mistake of not reading the manual before I started playing this thing, and it took me, like, no joke, half the game to sort of figure out what was happening with these things. Pretty much every enemy or obstacle in the game drops these little green orbs, and depending on the color inside the orb depends on what you get. So hold on to your britches, because we're going to go through every one of these for future posterity. Green and black orbs give you an extra life. Green and red orbs give you a twirling attack. Green and blue orbs gives you skates that make you so damn fast you literally can't control what you're doing, even more so. Green and white orbs are for fist attacks, whatever that means. You've got plenty of fist attacks. I don't get it. And finally, green and gray orbs will give you extra points. But wait a minute, because depending on the stage, those orbs can give you completely different power-ups, and you just kind of have to figure it out at that point. Even the manual's just like, I don't know, figure it out. Like I said, this game is just a mess all around. It's so bad that I was laughing my way through a lot of it because I couldn't believe what was going on. Like, look at this. In the sewer level, you have these like pipes above the level where you're supposed to use Toxie's mop to swing across, which is, yes, another thing he can do. But does this look like it was implemented very well? And this is actually me trying to do this. There's just so much of that in almost every stage. I just couldn't understand how this was released the way it is. At the very least, the game does try to mix in some shooter levels here and there, which are only moderately more playable, and the music, I mean, you can listen to it, but man, overall this game is just something. But you know what? I kind of recommend it, especially if you got a friend around, because this is just a special kind of bad game. It's so unplayable and hard to believe at times that it's kind of hilarious. I don't want to promote alcohol on this channel, but I'm just saying, if you got a friend and a few beers laying around, play this game. You'll see what I mean. It's also one of those games that maybe shouldn't have existed for a variety of reasons. Not only is it just a bad game all around, but it's based off a violent adult horror comedy that somehow became a kids show. Toxic Crusaders is actually a pretty direct window into just how strange the 80s and the early 90s were as far as what could end up being tossed in front of us kids. If you do want to experience this mess for yourself though, then loose Genesis carts are pretty affordable and easy to find these days. If you want the NES version, which is less terrible and actually kind of fun, that's even cheaper and worth a look if you want something that resembles a bit more of an actual video game. But in the end, Toxic Crusaders is only really notable for its origin story and just how spectacularly bad it turned out to be. So grab a friend and maybe a few adult beverages and come to terms with the fact that the only pollution you'll be cleaning up in this game is tossing the cartridge in the trash. First up, let's start off with a real winner. A game where the title is literally just him telling you that he's too cool to fool. That's the title, and that's what we're working with here, because it's 1992. That's right, Chester Cheetah Too Cool to Fool for the Super Nintendo came out back in December of 1992. Developed and published by Commando, it's one of those examples of early 90s corporate marketing logic that's just dressed up as a video game. And no, it is not good. But the story of how it actually came into existence is probably more fun than the game is. Chester Cheetah is of course the mascot for Cheetos, created in 1986 as a smooth sunglass-wearing cheetah designed to make cheese puffs seem cool to children. And for a while it kinda worked. Chester was very recognizable, the commercials were everywhere, and by the early 90s, Frito-Lay had enough confidence in the character to actually start expanding him into other media. In 1992, Chester was actually greenlit for his own Saturday morning cartoon on Fox Kids. Yo, It's the Chester Cheetah Show was in development and everything. And then a little advocacy group called Action for Children's Television stepped in and argued that by giving an advertising mascot his own cartoon show was essentially just giving kids a half-hour commercial, which to be fair is exactly what it was. The show was killed off before a single episode aired, the first time that organization had ever protested something that hadn't even been released yet. So no, Chester never got his cartoon. But he did get a video game though, 2 of them actually. This one in 1992 and a sequel called Wild Wild Quest in 1993. Commando developed both of them, but the premise here is that Chester has been thrown into a zoo by the villain Mean Eugene, who has also stolen parts to Chester's motorcycle. Your job is to retrieve those parts across 5 levels and finally escape the zoo. And no, it is not a premise that was designed to withstand scrutiny, but for a Chester Cheetah game, sure. The game itself is a side-scrolling platformer, and the first thing that you're probably going to notice is that Chester Cheetah, a cheetah, the fastest land animal on Earth, moves like he's walking through wet sand. There is technically a dash button, but it requires finding a shoe power-up hidden inside the level. And even after you find that, the wind-up that he does before he breaks into a sprint is long enough that you'll overshoot platforms and run into enemies more often than you're going to feel good about. For a game that's supposed to be about this cool, fast character, the experience of actually controlling Chester is incredibly monotonous. The level design across the 5 stages are about what you'd expect, very generic. You're making your way across a zoo, so don't expect much more than your standard zoo stages. There's almost no personality to the enemies that are populating those stages either, and actually jumping on top of them requires you to be surprisingly exact for some reason. Probably because Chester's massive head makes his hitbox the size of a small bus. Each stage, though, has a hidden motorcycle part that you need to find and collect before you can exit the stage. The problem is that the game gives you no real indication of where these parts are in a lot of the stages, so you just end up wandering around hoping that you stumble across them. Like the second level needs you to find this monkey who will then help you reach the part in another section of the stage. Nothing about this is made clear for the player, and it's the only time in the game where this ever happens. Other levels just give you the parts right at the exit, so I'm not entirely sure why they went this route. You do at least get some power-ups, but this may be the only game that I've ever played where the power-ups actually make the game worse. We already talked about the sneakers, but the sunglasses you can find let you see hidden items, which is funny because if you haven't already noticed, Chester's wearing sunglasses already. So apparently these are just special sunglasses. But they also have the side effect of making the screen significantly darker, making the game noticeably harder to see while you're actually using them. The guitar that you can find makes Chester invincible while he jams out, but when he's doing that, you lose all control of him while the animation just plays out over like 5 seconds. There's a section in the swamp stage where you're riding this hippo across the water, and the guitar power-up is directly in your path. Now, in a normal game, that would actually be fun to see, because then you could, kill all the enemies that are coming at you. But in this game, that's the worst thing you could possibly see, because collecting it causes Chester to start playing and then fall off the hippo into the water, and then making you redo the entire thing again. This is just peak game design. The villain, Mean Eugene, and his dog show up periodically as bosses, and they mostly just confuse you as to what you're actually supposed to do. The first boss actually just kind of shows up, wanders around for a bit, and then leaves. You're not even supposed to hit him. Other times, you do actually have to hit him, but the hit detection is so bad that you might not even realize it. The game does occasionally break things up with a vehicle section, but they're about as interesting as the rest of the game is, with you just dodging obstacles until it decides to end. The bird section in the last level is really the only notable one, simply because it's nearly impossible to make it through this thing, easily rivaling the Super NES Rocketeer flying stages as some of the worst on the system. Also, I kind of feel like I need to mention this. If you're wondering why there's no Cheetos in a game that's literally about Cheetos, it's actually because the game was pushing the new, at the time, Cheetos paws. So literally everything in this game is represented by Cheetos paws. Chester's health bar are little paws, which means you have to collect the big paws in the levels to refill them. All the smaller paws that you see are just collectibles. It kind of gets confusing. There's a lot of paws in this game. But the game doesn't really make it clear that those are supposed to be Cheetos. They just look like cartoon paws in the game. There's no bags or anything that Chester mentions anyway. So for a piece of product placement that's masquerading as entertainment, it kind of forgot to include the product. Chester Cheetah Too Cool to Fool is not a good game. It's not even entertainingly bad in the way that Toxic Crusaders was last week. What it is, though, is the perfect time capsule. The game sits right at that intersection of everything the early 90s were doing wrong simultaneously. The mascots with attitude trend, the food brand licensing trend, the desperate attempt to make products seem cool to kids who had already figured out that they were being marketed to. Chester never got his cartoon, he just got this instead. And for the kids that actually rented this game back in the day, I kind of wish he would have just got his cartoon instead. But there is proof that stuff like this can work. Cool Spot, the 7-Up mascot game that came out in the same year, is genuinely excellent and worth your time. That one proves that a good developer can take a ridiculous premise like this and make something good out of it. But I guess if you want to peek back in time to a specific moment in gaming history, then this might be worth like 10 minutes of your time. If you just want a good Super Nintendo platformer though, there's about 50 other options within arm's reach. But in the end, it ain't easy being cheesy, and it turns out that making a good game about cheese puffs ain't easy either. And the next game up ain't that much better. In fact, it's worse. How many of you out there are old enough to remember American Gladiators, a show that ran for 7 years and was one of the most unique and recognizable TV shows on at the time? I am definitely one of those people because I am a very old man, but I really like the show. The game, though, is absolute garbage. American Gladiators for the Super Nintendo came out back in 1993, developed by Imagitech Design and was published by GameTech. And it's so bad that one of the UK magazines at the time gave it a 6% rating. At the time, the lowest score that publication had ever handed out. That is a remarkable achievement on its own. There were very few games back then that ever got a review score that low in any magazine. So let's just see how we got to this point in the first place. American Gladiators, the TV show, ran in syndication from 1989 to 1996, and it was fun television if your definition of fun television involves watching a roided-up Nitro absolutely destroy some random schlub from Ohio. The format of the show was pretty simple. Contestants compete across a series of events against the resident gladiators, a rotating cast of professional athletes with names like Ice, Gemini, and Blaze. And then at the end of the show, everyone races through the Eliminator obstacle course to see who wins it all. It was basically the adult version of Guts, just without adults beating up the kids. And you gotta admit that this all looks like prime video game fodder for the time, and it was. An NES game came out in 1991 from Incredible Technologies and took significant liberties with the format. The events were reworked into these side-scrolling and overhead levels that only loosely resembled what actually happened in the show. It wasn't great, but I mean, compared to what you're about to see, it wasn't that bad. The Super Nintendo and the Genesis versions, though, they're the real deal. They arrived in 1993, and the pitch was that these were going to be more faithful adaptations to the TV show. All 7 events, all the real gladiators by name, including digitized photos of the actual cast, plus a tournament mode for up to 16 players to compete in. On paper, that sounds like a significant upgrade over the NES version. In practice, though, it basically just ended up being a bunch of truly awful mini-games stuffed into a really half-assed game. The Super Nintendo gives you all 7 events. Each one is its own separate minigame, viewed from different camera angles. The problem is that almost every single event is barely playable at best and incomprehensible at worst. Joust, which should feel like a tense back-and-forth duel on a raised platform, has you hitting a button with a direction on the controller which will either move you or make you swing, and sometimes it seems completely random as to what will actually happen. And yes, it feels as bad as it looks. The wall, which should feel like a desperate scramble against a gladiator trying to yank you down, involves just tapping buttons as fast as you can while occasionally getting stuck on a corner for some reason, and then sliding helplessly back down when you get caught. And the iconic Atlasphere event, the one where you're inside a giant rolling ball trying to score goals, is reduced to just slowly rolling around with some really bad physics here. Powerball is the football type event and should have some genuine chaos to it, just like the show. But again, we're stuck with an overhead view here where the AI is so easy to juke that you can basically just score at will if you can press left and then right on the controller a couple of times. Assault, though, is one of the events that actually would have been perfect for a game, since it's literally just hiding behind cover and shooting at a dude that's shooting at you. But the game manages to screw that up with an overhead view that then goes into a behind-the-back view, where you then have to slowly pick up the weapon and use this aiming thing over here to fire it. And it gives you no clue on what you need to do or how you need to aim. You're supposed to score points for hitting different zones on the target, except the game never really shows you anything that you hit. You fire and some numbers change if you get lucky. Whether you hit the bullseye or the outer rim is just information the game's decided that you don't need to see. And speaking of the game giving you absolutely no idea what you're doing, Human Cannonball had reviewers at the time saying they couldn't even figure out how to play the thing. Basically, it has 2 different gauges that instantly start filling. One is your speed and the other is your angle. It's almost impossible to get this right though, since if you're off by just a bit, you're either too slow or too fast. Oh, and don't forget to tuck at the last second. Finally, there's the Eliminator, and this is the one that actually feels most like what these games typically try to do. Just jam left and right on the shoulder buttons faster than your opponent, dodge some stuff, jump over some hurdles, and get to the finish line before your opponent. It's classic Olympic game style button mashing, it's head-to-head, and it's actually kind of fun. Too bad it's over in like 15 seconds. And that is it, diggity dog. There is basically nothing else to this game. Even if you do win, there's no screen or anything like that saying congratulations. You just get dumped back to the menu screen and then realize that you've played the whole game in like 2 minutes. Plus, there's just nothing to keep you going back for anything. It looks crappy, there's almost no sound effects to the whole thing, and you listen to the same 2 music tracks the entire game. They couldn't even be bothered to put in crowd noise into the game, which was so important to the TV show. Here, you get thrown off a platform, it's just silence. You score in Powerball, silence. The show was defined by all the drunks in the crowd and its over-the-top presentation. But the game shipped with essentially none of that. There is a tournament mode that supports up to 16 players, which I guess is kind of an added bonus, with everyone competing across all the different events to finally crown a winner. In theory, this would be a neat little party game, but if you're asking 15 other human beings to sit in a room and take turns playing American Gladiators for the Super Nintendo, people would pay you to leave. American Gladiators on the Super Nintendo is a game that committed to being faithful to its source material, and then forgot that faithfulness to a TV show and actually being fun are 2 different goals that require separate effort. Yes, all 7 events are here, and yes, the real gladiators are represented, the digitized art is here and all that, but none of that matters when every single event is the opposite of fun. The sad thing is, though, that the show deserved a game that could capture some of its energy. The crowd noise, the drama, that specific joy of watching Nitro take someone out at the knees, that's what we needed. What we got instead, though, was a mostly silent collection of button-mashing mini-games that you can barely figure out how to play. If you grew up watching the show and just want to revisit the game for nostalgia reasons, maybe spend like 5 minutes with it and then go watch actual clips from the show instead. The show still holds up, but this game obviously does not. And I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but if you want a better version of this kind of game on the Super Nintendo, go play Guts instead. And last, but certainly not least, we've got a game based on Ronald McDonald. But before the Genesis kids start screeching and ripping their tits off because this game is even on the list, don't worry, I'm not trying to poo-poo on Ronald here. In fact, it's one of the best platformers on the Genesis, not just a good license game, like one of the best platformers full stop. This is McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. It came out on the Genesis in 1993 and was developed by a little-known developer at the time called Treasure. So yeah, you already know this is gonna be good. But the reason this game is on the list is because it literally should never have been as good as it is. Treasure's probably one of the most beloved game developers in Genesis history. Stuff like Gunstar Heroes, Dynamite Headdy, Alien Soldier. I mean, they built an entire reputation for technically ambitious action games that pushed the Genesis in ways that most studios weren't even trying. And they are certainly not a developer that you typically associate with fast food mascot platformers aimed at kids. So here's how that happened. Treasure was founded back in 1992 by Masato Magawa, and I probably just completely murdered his name. But basically, they were a group of developers who left Konami because they were frustrated because they were just making sequels all the time. They had already started work on Gunstar Heroes when they went to Sega looking for a publishing deal. Sega, of course, said no. Treasure had no track record, no released games, nothing to prove that they could actually deliver something. So instead of a publishing contract, Sega offered them a different deal. Develop a McDonald's game for us first and prove that you can ship the product. Then we'll talk about your original game. But Treasure didn't just toss out a throwaway game here so that they could make their own stuff. Instead, Treasure approached it with the same care that they'd give one of Sega's major mascot platformers. Of course, the game is pretty much just your basic platformer though, far more basic than what you're probably used to from Treasure. Essentially, all you're doing is collecting pieces of a treasure map from a trio of villains across 4 different worlds. Ronald himself does have a few things that he can do, like a magic attack that fires sparkly stars across the screen, and a scarf, which stretches out and latches onto hooks that are scattered throughout each level, letting you swing across gaps and pull yourself up to higher platforms. The scarf, though, is the big gimmick here, and the whole game is kinda designed around it. Levels are built to reward experimentation with it, and finding different routes throughout each section is actually pretty fun. And the whole thing just comes together better than what you'd expect from your typical licensed kids game. You can even play a Tetris minigame to earn extra items, and that's just swell. And since this is a treasure game, you know the bosses are probably gonna be the highlight, and they are. Every boss in this game, though, needs to eat one of your jewels that you have before you can actually do any damage to them, which turns every fight into like this two-stage puzzle of figuring out when they'll steal a jewel and then getting to the point where you can actually do some damage. It's actually a pretty fun little boss mechanic. And you remember how in the Cheetos game that like none of the bosses felt like they should even be in the game? Well, each one here feels like it was designed with actual fun in mind, rather than just dropped in as an afterthought. I mean, it's all really good, but I guess the only real problem with the game is it's just really short. There's only 4 worlds in the game, and each one of them just has a few platforming sections and a boss fight, and that's pretty much it. It probably doesn't help that the North American version defaults to the beginner difficulty, which makes it even easier if you don't realize that. But really, it's not a hard game at any level, so I guess it doesn't much matter. But everything it does with so much fun and polish that the length almost works in its favor. Stages with neat gimmicks come and go without making you tired of it, and it never repeats any of it, kind of making you want to play through it again just to find new ways through them. McDonald's Treasureland Adventure is the best possible version of something that just had no business being this good. Treasure took a corporate fast food license and treated it with complete sincerity, and ended up making a more polished and playable platformer than most studios were making at the time. The scarf mechanic's fun, the boss fights are pretty neat, and the whole thing just looks and sounds really great in that specific Treasure way. But is it Gunstar Heroes level? No, it's not. It's shorter and clearly aimed at a younger audience. As a platformer though, it does sit comfortably in the upper tier of what the Genesis had to offer, licensed or otherwise. It's also just the perfect rebuttal to every lazy license game that we've covered today. Chester Cheetah existed to sell Cheetos and then forgot to be a game in the process. American Gladiators existed to put a logo on a cartridge. But the difference between this game and those other games is because Treasure decided to take it completely seriously, and in the process, made a really great game. If you've never played it, then do yourself a favor and track one down. It's almost certainly the best thing McDonald's has ever put its name on, and that includes the French fries.